The woman entered the church just as Pastor Daniel raised his hands to receive the greatest honor of his ministry. Beside her stood two teenagers who carried his unmistakable features. Then she looked towards the altar and said, "Before you make him a bishop, ask him why his own children have been forbidden from calling him father."
The Lagos auditorium hummed with a sound that felt like living electricity. 25 years of labor had converged into this single, cavernous space. Thousands of congregants sat in rows that stretched into the shadows of the rafters, their collective breath creating a heavy, humid atmosphere. Pastor Daniel Adeyemi stood at the center of the stage, his pulse steady, his gaze fixed on the senior bishops waiting in the wings. This was the summit. Every sermon, every morning spent in prayer, every administrative hurdle cleared, had been a step toward this hour of his consecration. The air held the sharp, clean scent of thousands of white lilies banked against the altar. He felt the weight of the moment in the silence that preceded the music. It was a perfect, calibrated stillness. He had built this, brick by brick, foundation by foundation. Outside, the city was a blur of heat and noise. But here, inside the sanctuary, time had stopped to acknowledge his ascent. He took a slow breath, squared his shoulders, and waited for the signal to kneel, unaware that the foundation he stood upon was already beginning to fracture. Beside Daniel sat Grace. She remained perfectly still, her hands resting flat on her lap. To the thousands watching, she was the quintessential partner, the silent architect of his success. But beneath the surface of the ceremony, the history of their climb remained etched in her memory. She remembered the small, tin-roofed hall that served as their first ministry. She remembered the day she had unclasped her gold bangles and her heavy diamond-set earrings, placing them into a velvet bag to pay the landlord who threatened to lock them out. She had walked home that day with empty wrists and a burning resolve. Over the decades, those missing pieces of gold had transformed into the stained glass and high-vaulted ceilings of this massive auditorium. She looked at Daniel now, her expression one of unwavering support. She had traded her personal belongings for his vision, fueling the engine of their shared life with every sacrifice she made. The congregation saw a woman of grace and poise. They did not see the years of quiet labor that had bought the very stage they sat upon. She breathed in the scent of the lilies, tethering herself to the reality of the present, unaware that the foundation she had helped build was about to be dismantled by the truth. The heavy air within the auditorium seemed to pulse with a low, rhythmic vibration. Thousands of congregants sat in synchronized silence, their collective attention focused entirely on the altar. The scent of white lilies was overwhelming, a cloying sweetness that clung to the velvet cushions and the polished wood of the pews. Light filtered through the high, arched windows, casting long, geometric shadows across the center aisle. Every cough was stifled. Every movement was deliberate. It was a cathedral of expectation. Daniel sat motionless, his gaze fixed on the senior bishop, while the rows of people behind him waited for the final prayers to commence. The hum of the room was not a noise, but a frequency, a collective surrender to the ceremony. It was a space built for reverence, carefully curated to shut out the grit of the world outside. The silence grew denser, tighter, pressing against the eardrums of everyone present. It was a singular moment of harmony, a perfect, unbroken loop of tradition and authority. In this profound stillness, the weight of the upcoming change was invisible, hidden beneath the veneer of a perfectly executed ritual, leaving the entire assembly suspended in a state of absolute, fragile peace. The absolute stillness of the room shattered. A sharp, booming crack echoed through the high-vaulted ceiling as the heavy oak doors at the back of the auditorium swung open with violent force. The sound was not part of the liturgy. It was an intrusion, a thunderclap in the middle of a prayer. Every head in the front rows snapped toward the rear. Standing at the threshold, framed by the blinding daylight pouring in from the outside world, stood Amaka Okafor. She did not hesitate. She stepped forward, her movements precise and unyielding. Beside her walked two teenagers, a boy and a girl, moving in sync with her pace. As they stepped into the filtered light of the hall, the congregation fell into a deeper, more terrified silence. The boy kept his head high, his gaze fixed on the altar. As he moved past the first few rows, the resemblance became impossible to ignore. His jawline mirrored the sharp, angular structure of Daniel's, and the curve of his chin was a carbon copy of the man sitting on the stage. The girl walked with a similar poise, her eyes scanning the room with a cold, piercing intensity. The air in the auditorium shifted from sacred to suffocating. Amaka did not walk, she marched. The center aisle, usually a path of solemn procession, became a gauntlet. Her footsteps clicked against the marble floor, a sharp, rhythmic sound that cut through the lingering echoes of the interrupted prayer. Behind her, the two teenagers kept pace, their expressions unreadable but their presence impossible to ignore. As they moved past the middle pews, the atmosphere transformed. A wave of murmurs rippled outward, starting from the back and rushing toward the stage like a rising tide. Thousands of people leaned into the aisle, their necks craned to catch a glimpse of the boy whose face held the undeniable imprint of the man on the podium. A collective gasp broke the remaining silence, a ragged intake of breath that sounded like a collective shudder. People stood up, clutching their programs, their eyes darting between the intruders and the altar. Daniel remained seated, his hands gripped so tightly on the arms of his chair that his knuckles turned white. The senior bishop shifted, his eyes widening as he realized the ceremony could no longer proceed. Amaka ignored the wall of stairs, her focus locked on the platform. She stopped at the front row, the distance between her and the pastor closing to a few final feet, and the entire auditorium held its breath, waiting for the first word. Amaka reached the base of the platform. She did not wait for an invitation. She reached up, grabbed the heavy microphone stand from its mount, and twisted the grip until the mic angled downward, capturing her voice with a sharp electronic pop that echoed across the rafters. The teenagers stood behind her, their presence acting as a physical anchor for her claim. She did not look at the senior bishop or the elders. Her eyes remained locked on the man seated above her. She pulled a brown envelope from under her arm, the paper crinkling in the silence of the room. She held it steady, her fingers white-knuckled against the edge. "Before you make him a bishop," she said, her voice amplified and distorted by the speakers, "ask him why his children have been forbidden from calling him father." She gestured sharply toward the boy and the girl standing at her side. The air in the auditorium seemed to thin. The congregants in the front pews pushed back, creating a physical gap between themselves and the altar. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the hum of the electrical equipment. Amaka did not move. She waited for the man on the stage to acknowledge the truth standing right in front of him. Daniel rose slowly. He forced a smile, though it did not reach his eyes. His movements were calculated, practiced to project authority, but his jaw remained locked. He adjusted his position, placing his back slightly toward the heavy velvet curtains behind the stage. "I do not know what this woman is talking about," he stated. His voice lacked its usual resonance, cracking slightly at the edges. He did not look at the teenagers. He did not look at Amaka. His gaze swept across the front rows, his eyes darting toward the side exits where the security team stood frozen in confusion. He gripped the wood of the podium, his knuckles pale against the polished surface. He needed the room to believe him, but the air felt thin, suffocating. He took a half step back, his heel catching on a cable, forcing him to stumble. He recovered instantly, but the mask of the composed leader had begun to slip. Beads of sweat formed along his hairline. He scanned the crowd, seeking a friendly face, but found only blank stares and murmurs. He turned slightly, his eyes tracking the distance to the stage stairs. He was no longer leading a congregation. He was calculating a retreat. The denial hung in the air, hollow and fragile. Amaka did not blink. She reached into the brown envelope and pulled out a thick stack of photographs, fanning them out like a deck of cards. She held them up, high enough for the cameras mounted on the pillars to capture the images and project them onto the massive screens flanking the stage. The first image appeared, a sunlit living room, years in the past. Daniel sat on a sofa, his face relaxed, holding an infant Chinadu against his chest. The likeness was unmistakable. The boy's jawline, his brow, the very shape of his hands, it was a mirror image captured in silver halide. A low, collective murmur swelled from the back of the auditorium, moving forward like a tide. Daniel's eyes flicked toward the screens. He froze. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin ashen under the stage lights. He stepped back, but the images kept coming. Amaka held up another, showing him in a backyard, laughing while tossing the child into the air. The evidence was not just a claim anymore. It was a physical document of a life he had spent years erasing. The congregation leaned in, the silence of the room replaced by the sharp, rhythmic clicking of cameras from the press box. Amaka did not wait for the shock to subside. She dropped the photographs and pulled a thick, blue folder from the envelope. Her hands were steady as she opened it, revealing rows of bank statements, highlighted in bright yellow ink. She stepped toward the edge of the stage, holding the documents toward the front row. These were not memories. They were ledgers. She began to read, her voice cutting through the thick silence like a blade. Monthly payments, dating back 6 years, she announced. For rent, for school fees, all routed through the Kingdom Life Widow Support Foundation. A ripple of confusion turned into a sharp intake of breath across the pews. The foundation was the pride of the church, a fund dedicated to the most vulnerable. Every congregant knew its purpose. Amaka gestured to the dates on the pages, matching them to the timeline of her own life. Daniel reached out as if to snatch the papers, but his hand stopped in midair, trembling. The connection was undeniable. The money meant for grieving women and orphans had been diverted to build a quiet, secret existence for a family he refused to acknowledge. The numbers on the screen were cold, precise, and absolute. The foundation had been hollowed out from the inside. Grace sat frozen in the chair. The documents lay across her lap, the paper crisp and heavy under her fingertips. She leaned forward, her eyes scanning the familiar letterhead of the Widow Support Foundation. Her vision blurred, then sharpened on the specific dates, the very months she had spent organizing charity galas and pleading with donors to give more. Her hands began to shake, a fine, uncontrollable vibration that rattled the pages against her knees. She traced the signature on a transfer authorization. It was a digital copy of her own husband's hand. The realization arrived not as a sudden blow, but as a slow, freezing tide. Every dollar she had raised, every personal sacrifice she had made to keep that foundation solvent, had been a funnel for the life he hid behind closed doors. She looked up at Daniel, expecting a flicker of shame, but saw only the panicked calculations of a cornered man. She reached out, gripping the armrests until her knuckles turned white. The air in the auditorium felt thin, devoid of oxygen. She looked back at the ledger, the numbers blurring into a single, damning indictment of their entire marriage. The foundation she had championed was the weapon he used to build his secondary world, and she had been the one to sharpen the blade. The heavy silence of the auditorium was broken by the sharp sound of leather soles against the stage floor. Chinedu stepped out from behind his mother, his movements stiff and deliberate. He stopped 10 feet from the podium where Daniel stood. The boy's face was a mirror of the man's own features, a resemblance that made the congregants gasp. Chinedu opened his mouth, but the first sound was a ragged, uneven breath. He cleared his throat and tried again. "You told us to wait," he said, his voice cracking under the weight of the massive room. "Every time we asked for a place in your life, you told us to stay hidden. You said we had to wait until you became a bishop." He took another step forward, his eyes locked on Daniel's face. "You told us that your position was the only thing that mattered, that once you reached the top, you would finally acknowledge us as your own." The boy's voice grew louder, shedding its tremor. "We lived in the shadows for years because you were afraid of losing the pulpit. We were not your children to you. We were a liability you were waiting to discard." He gestured toward the thousands of silent, staring people. "Look at them now, Father. Is this what you sacrificed us for?" Daniel did not look at his son. Instead, he snapped his fingers toward the wings of the stage. 2 men in dark uniforms began to move forward, their eyes fixed on Amaka and the children. They pushed past the first row of pews, their heavy boots thudding against the floor. Daniel gestured toward the exit, his face tight. But before the guards could reach the steps, a chair scraped violently against the wood. Grace stood up. She did not hesitate. She moved with a sudden, sharp speed that cut across the path of the security men. She planted herself directly in their way. her arms outstretched to create a barrier between the guards and the family. The men slowed, uncertain, caught between their instructions and the woman who had been the architect of the ministry beside them. Grace turned to look at them, her chin held high, her posture rigid. She did not look at Daniel. She stood as a wall, her presence commanding the space, forcing the guards to halt their advance. The auditorium fell into a deeper, heavier stillness. She had chosen. The ministry was no longer her priority. The truth was the only thing left to defend. She held her position, unmoving, while the guards stalled in the aisle, looking back at the podium for a command that would not come. Amaka reached into her bag. Her fingers fumbled briefly against the fabric before she pulled out a small, rectangular device. The auditorium was so quiet that the click of her thumb against the plastic button echoed like a gunshot. She pressed down. A sharp metallic hiss preceded the voice. It was Daniel's voice, unmistakable and cold, filling the massive chamber through the high-fidelity speakers. "Once the announcement is made, I will find a way to introduce them," the recording blared. "Grace cannot know yet." The words hung in the air, stripped of their usual pulpit authority. On the recording, Daniel sounded calculated, his tone devoid of the warmth he projected from the stage. The playback continued, detailing the logistical maneuvers of his secret life. The congregation did not move. Thousands of faces turned from the stage toward the speakers, then back to the man standing at the podium. Daniel's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The evidence was absolute. A low hum of murmurs began to rise from the back rows, growing into a wave of disbelief that crashed against the stage. The man who had been minutes away from his consecration stood exposed by his own recorded words. The atmosphere shifted from tense anticipation to a cold, jagged realization of betrayal. Grace stood still while the audio recording faded into a dead, ringing silence. She reached up to her neck, her fingers finding the clasp of the gold-threaded scarf she had worn as the matriarch of the assembly. She unhooked it with a steady, deliberate motion. The fabric slipped through her fingers, and she laid it flat across the front seat of the row, a final surrender of her status. She did not look at the security guards or the congregants. She turned fully toward the podium where Daniel remained frozen. Her eyes were hard, fixed on his face, stripping away the years of pretense. "You did not protect the ministry," she said, her voice cutting through the murmurs in the hall. She stepped closer to the stage edge, her movements precise and devoid of hesitation. "You used it to protect yourself." Every word carried the weight of a gavel. The congregation watched as the woman who had built the foundations of their faith dismantled the man at its center. Grace did not seek validation from the crowd. She offered only the truth. She stood tall, her presence no longer serving the man who had betrayed the foundation of their life together. The space between them felt like a canyon, unbridgeable and absolute. Grace turned her gaze toward the senior bishop, who remained seated behind the pulpit. The man rose slowly, his face etched with a stern, unforgiving gravity. He looked at the empty space where the consecration ceremony had been seconds away from completion. "The consecration is suspended," the bishop announced. His voice was flat, devoid of any attempt to save face for the institution. Grace stepped into the center aisle, her posture rigid and focused. She addressed the assembly, her words ringing clear across the vast, hushed hall. "I am stepping down from all leadership roles, effective immediately," she declared. She did not look back at Daniel, who remained motionless behind her. Her hands were folded, her eyes scanning the front rows where the board members sat in stunned silence. "I will cooperate with any and all investigations into the ministry funds," she continued. "The truth is the only foundation left." She signaled toward the exits, her movements signaling a complete break from the environment she had spent decades building. The silence in the auditorium was heavy, broken only by the sound of her footsteps as she walked toward the back of the hall. The ceremony had collapsed, leaving the pulpit empty and the accounts open for scrutiny. The audit began within 48 hours. Forensic accountants occupied the church offices, their stacks of ledger books creating a paper wall between the present and the past. Each page turned revealed the same pattern: falsified invoices, diverted widow support funds, and private accounts padded with ministry wealth. The evidence was absolute. Within a week, the church board met in a closed-door session that lasted until dawn. They did not debate. They presented the findings. Daniel was stripped of his title and barred from the pulpit before the next Sunday arrived. Security personnel escorted him to the official residence, where he was given 1 hour to clear his belongings. He stood in the center of the living room, watching as his books, awards, and personal items were boxed by strangers. When the deadline passed, they took his keys. The heavy front door clicked shut behind him, sealing him out of the life he had spent 25 years constructing. He turned to face the street, clutching a single suitcase, standing on the sidewalk as a private citizen. The church gates remained closed to him. The system he had manipulated had finally functioned exactly as designed, leaving no room for his return. Grace packed her own life into 3 plain boxes. She left the official residence without looking back, moving into a quiet apartment where the walls held no history of the ministry. The silence was absolute, a stark contrast to the constant hum of congregants. She spent her first week in this new space writing letters. They were directed to her own children, whom she had neglected in the shadow of her husband's ambitions. She did not ask for immediate forgiveness, she asked for a conversation. When the replies were slow, she turned her attention to Chinedu and Adeyemi. She tracked them through a mutual acquaintance, sending a message that contained no demands, only an offer of support for their medical and academic needs. She met them in a neutral, public park on a rainy Tuesday. Chinedu kept his distance, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, while Adeyemi watched Grace with a guarded, searching gaze. Grace sat on the damp bench, hands resting in her lap, and simply listened as they spoke of the years they spent in the periphery. It was a slow, agonizing process of dismantling the walls of secrets. Every word shared was a heavy stone removed from a foundation that had been built on nothing but deception. Grace realized that healing could not remain a private affair. She leased a small, windowless office above a bookstore, turning the space into a hub for those discarded by the church hierarchy. Her first task was formalizing the intake process for victims of spiritual abuse. She spent hours filing records, documenting the patterns of manipulation she had witnessed for decades. Resistance came quickly. Former associates from the assembly called her, warning her to remain silent, claiming she was damaging the reputation of the faith. She did not argue. She simply hung up the phone and redirected her focus to the stack of testimonies growing on her desk. She hired a lawyer to navigate the legal complexities of nonprofit status, ensuring the new organization had the teeth to demand accountability. By the end of the second month, the office was no longer empty. People arrived in the morning, sitting in the hard plastic chairs of the waiting area, clutching folders of evidence. Grace greeted each one, her eyes steady, her voice devoid of the performative softness that had once defined her life in the auditorium. She was building a structure where truth was not a threat, but the primary requirement. The organization was born not from ambition, but from the wreckage of a life left behind. Months had passed, and the world had moved on. But for Daniel, time had stalled in this small, windowless room. The walls were bare, painted a flat, peeling gray that absorbed the dim overhead light. No entourage waited outside to buffer him from the world. No hushed whispers of reverence followed his footsteps. He sat on a hard-backed wooden chair, his posture bent, the weight of his actions finally settling into his shoulders. He reached up, his fingers lingering on his collar before he pulled it away, laying the strip of plastic on the table. It was a simple, small movement, yet it marked the end of a lifetime of performance. He looked at the small group of people sitting across from him, their faces not filled with the adoration he once craved, but with the cold expectation of honesty. He cleared his throat, the sound sharp in the cramped air. He did not look for a camera or a microphone. He spoke to the floor. He laid out the years of calculated deceit, the misuse of the foundation, and the deliberate silence he had forced upon his own family. He spoke without the cadence of a sermon, his voice cracking under the pressure of his own words. There was no power left to protect, only a wreckage to acknowledge. He finished, the silence in the room heavy, final, and absolute. Across the city, in a room filled with natural light, Grace stood before a small, quiet gathering. The walls were not lined with gold or heavy velvet, but with the faces of those who had sought refuge in her new mission. She placed her notes on the wooden podium, her hands steady. She did not raise her voice to command attention. She spoke with the weight of experience. She looked at each person, acknowledging the shared history of silence they were all working to dismantle. The air in the room felt thin and clean, stripped of the performative rituals that had once suffocated her own life. She leaned forward, the wood of the podium pressing into her palms. She told them that the past could not be undone, but it could be faced. She looked toward the window, where the afternoon sun hit the glass, and spoke clearly. Redemption does not begin when a powerful man is protected from consequences. Redemption begins when the truth is finally allowed to stand in the light. The room remained still. The echoes of her words did not fade into a sermon, but settled into the floorboards as a promise. She stepped away from the podium, finally free from the shadows of the auditorium, and walked toward the open door, where the rest of her life was waiting.